fourth session, I want us to think about how endurance is central to Christianity. Indeed, it's one of those characteristics, one of those virtues that is all over the New Testament. We've already looked at a couple of places where endurance shows up in the Old Testament, the book of Daniel, the story of Joseph, the stories of the wilderness wanderings. And actually, there are all kinds of Old Testament stories that approach the same theme, whether we're talking about the saga of Abraham or what happens in the book of Judges, or other stories. The whole saga of King David, which is so central to the Jewish faith, is really a story of endurance. But when we come to the New Testament, it's clear that from the very beginning, that the early church prized the ability to be able to withstand suffering, face challenges, and endure. Indeed, it was central of what they saw of Jesus, who was able to continue to be faithful even though he would face the greatest adversity in the cross. Now, I want us to focus this story, even though we could look at lots of different places, and we will look at a couple others too, but in this session I want us to focus on the story of Paul. Now, Paul is introduced to the concept that he's going to have to suffer from the very beginning. When he's converted, in his story of conversion, he's told from Jesus, I will show, or it said about him, I will show him what he has to suffer for my name. And indeed, he does. In the book of 2 Corinthians, Paul has this moment where he recounts some of the things that he's suffered for the sake of Christ. He says, 5 times, let's say this. He says, I have far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless floggings, and often near deaths. And this is chapter 11, verse 24. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I received a stoning. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I'm just going to say once is enough for me on that, right? 3 times I was shipwrecked. For a night and a day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, in dangers from bandits, dangers from my own people, dangers from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger from the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers and sisters, and toil and hardship through many a sleepless night, hungry and naked, and often without food, cold and naked. And besides other things, I am under daily pressure because of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak, and I am not weak? Who is made to stumble, and I'm not indignant? Now, Paul says that these are the things, he says, if I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. My weakness. Later on in the 12th chapter, he goes on to say, this is something that's very familiar about the story of Paul, that he has what he refers to as a thorn in the flesh, right? He says, to keep me from being too elated, a thorn was giving me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from being too elated or perhaps too proud, right? 3 times I appealed to the Lord about this, that it would leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And so I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore I am content with weaknesses and insults and hardships and persecutions and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. Now, in this section, Paul is talking about, he's kind of reflecting on the whole of his journey in Christ, what it's meant for him to live this life as an apostle who's carrying the word of Christ into many different lands, and who has paid a heavy price for it. But do you notice what he's learned along the way? He's learned to treasure his weakness. He's learned to treasure the experience of being at the end of his rope, of feeling like he can't go on. He's speaking to something very important about the nature of endurance here. Endurance isn't about becoming so strong that you rise up and you just throw down on your opponents and you beat everybody to death with your strength. Rather, endurance is the experience of finding the limit of your strength. It's finding that place where you feel weak, because then you place your dependence on God. Endurance isn't about overcoming because of your own power. It's about becoming dependent on God's power so that you just continue to place one foot in front of the other, continue to take the next step in faith. That's what endurance is. The capacity to continue because of your trust that the Lord goes with you. This is a really important thing for the early church because they faced all kinds of situations where they were at the end of their own capacity. They were very much aware of how limited their own strength and abilities were. And so they instead learned to rely on God, on God to get them through, not just for their whole lives, right? But to rely on God to get them through one day after the next. One day, one day, one day. Just taking one step, one step, one step. And the thing is that even though you feel weak, when you say to yourself, I think I can only manage one more step, and you take that one next step, you know what you're exhibiting? Endurance. Because endurance is about persistence, persevering through the trial, just continuing one more day and one more step. And the thing is that as you go through that process, then what's being formed in you is a greater capacity to endure. I may feel like today all I can do is just go one more step, right? But the next day I look backwards and I say, I could do one more step than I thought I could. I could do one more step. I can take one more day of this. The early church saw a beauty in that because they knew that their way of finding victory in the world was not going to be by rising to power and by overcoming their enemies by force. Rather, it was going to be by relying on God so that as their enemies tried and attacked them over and over and over again, as they experienced hardships, some of which didn't come from enemies, like Paul says, like sometimes it was just being shipwrecked or being hungry or something like that, right? That they learned to prize the virtue of continuing in faith anyways, to continue to rely on God, even in the middle of that place where you feel like you're being stretched to your limits. For a meditative exercise today, what I want to offer in this session is simply a phrase to meditate on. And I'm going to invite you to do this for 10 or 15 minutes before coming back for the challenge that'll wrap up this session. What I want to invite you to do, though, is I want to invite you to meditate on a particular phrase that revolves around this idea of endurance helping us find our trust in God. And the phrase is simply this: "Oh God, let me understand my limits so that I may understand that you are without limit." Now, you don't have to use exactly all that language, but basically what I want you to meditate on is this: God, let me know that your power greets me in that space where I find myself at the end of my own power and limits. Or perhaps we should say it with the words of Paul, right? When Paul says that I'll boast of the things that show my weakness. Or when he says later on, he says, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. So I want to invite you to meditate on the limits of your own abilities, the limits of your own power and your own strength. And instead, turn to God and rely on what God offers you to get through for just one step, one step. All right, we'll come back with a challenge in a minute.